and welcome to our introduction to animals. Today, we're going to be talking about basic characteristics that all animals have in common. And so, remember this diagram that showed the different kingdoms. And so, here you can see that we're in the last kingdom and of our eukarya domain, and fungi are our closest ancestors. They're heterotrophic like we are. Remember that protists, there's some protists, and we're going to talk about it, that may be similar or our ancestors for animals, but they're single cell, right? So, some of the general characteristics that we have for animals includes that we are all multicellular. So, protists are single cell. So, no protist could be classified as animals. We're heterotrophs, and so part of that is how we eat and how we digest the food. So, all animals have to eat somehow and have to digest food. We don't have any cell walls, or we don't do photosynthesis. Obviously, cell walls, unlike fungi that have cell walls made out of chitin, we don't have any cell walls, but we're going to talk about chitin in a moment. And this one's a interesting one. Make sure you star it. So cells are organized into tissues, meaning there's a higher level of organization to our systems. But and so from tissues goes to organs, and organs goes to organ systems, right? And depending on the animal, that might progress. But all animals have tissues, except there's one animal that does not, and that animal is the sponge. So other animals have at least tissues, and we also have movement. So that means that at some point in all of animals' lives, they move. Now, that is not movement is not always present their entire lives, and we'll talk about that also. And they have to reproduce in order to keep the species from continuing. All right, let's talk about that protist I was telling you about. So, choanoflagellates are the protists that are considered to be our ancestors. They lived 540 million years ago, and they are considered our ancestors because um, they actually lived in colonies. Um, and so they were the first organisms to be known who lived together. Okay, so our next um, discussion is on how are all these animals classified. So how are they divided? Now we understand the basic characteristics of all animals, but now we're going to start breaking them down into groups. So we have two groups here, the invertebrate group and the vertebrate group. So invertebrates have no backbones, have basically no spine, no bones growing. If you look at the pictures here, you will see some pictures of invertebrates. And this is the majority of the animals are invertebrates: insects, worms, jellyfish, sea stars. And vertebrates are animals that have a backbone, and that is basically the rest, 5%, right? Not too many, but if we think about all the fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals that there are in the whole planet, it puts it into perspective how many invertebrates there are. And so vertebrates are animals that have backbones. Okay, now we either have these backbones or we don't, but we're also able to be broken down by the skeleton, the body support, the skeleton. So exo, remember from exocytosis, exo means exit. So the exoskeleton is the skeleton found on the outer part of the animal. So many invertebrates have exoskeletons. You notice them here. So they have some sort of hard protective layer that takes them, that basically protects the animal inside. And the animal, many of these invertebrates don't have endoskeletons. A few do, but the majority do not. They just have exoskeletons that basically protects them. It prevents water loss, so it kind of protects all their internal systems. Another interesting thing about exoskeletons is that they basically is what molts. So if you think about animals that molt, they're molting their exoskeletons because unlike bones, exoskeletons do not grow with the organism. They shed and they grow a new one. And now let's look at the endoskeleton. So endoskeleton is the bone system, and it basically gives a lot of support for the body and protects everything inside. And interestingly enough is that these bones do grow as the organisms grows and develops. So next feature, how we divide animals is by reproduction. So there's many different types of reproductions in animals. One type is asexual. Now, I must say asexual reproduction is very rare in animals, but it happens. And sometimes it happens, they may do asexual and sexual reproduction. So we'll talk about some of those as well. But you guys are familiar with budding and fragmentation. Fragmentation here, the sea star fragments. It can lose a limb and then it'll just regrow a new one. And that limb that it just broke off actually can regenerate into an entire brand new copy of the original star. So that's pretty cool. These two you have not heard about yet. Regeneration, I'm sorry, I just explained regeneration. Parthenogenesis. So parthenogenesis is when an organism is able to lay or have eggs, have organisms without a fertilization of a male part. So in this case, this Komodo dragon, they are able to lay eggs without a male, and those eggs actually grow into be a copy of this Komodo dragon. A lot of these are adaptations. Komodo dragons are very aggressive and fight a lot, and they might not be surviving today because they might have killed each other in war instead of reproducing. So this is a way to maintain the species. Another type, or the other type of reproduction is sexual. And so we divide all of the animals by different types of reproduction. So we have hermaphroditic animals. We have animals that have internal reproduction and external internal fertilization and external fertilization. I'm going to talk about hermaphroditic animals for a minute. So this clownfish here is hermaphroditic. Clownfish are, and what that means is, again, it's an adaptation. So let's say that you have a male and a female clownfish, and the female dies. The male will then turn female in order to continue to keep the species going. So this is another way of adaptations to help the species go. Many animals go through like cycles of being male to female or female to male through nature, through their entire lives. Some are hermaphroditic at the same time, like male and female at the same time, but the majority actually will take turns. And we're gonna watch this video on internal versus external fertilization now.
All alone in a vast emptiness. A baby sea urchin, a Pluteus. Blind and deaf, its sole purpose is to find the right place to land. Here's what it'll become: an adult sea urchin. Basically, a rugged ball of spines, built to survive some of the harshest environments in the ocean. Like their cousins, the sea stars and sand dollars, sea urchins have little tube feet. They use them to move around and pull kelp into their mouths. And between their spines are pincers called pedicellariae that they use to groom themselves. Each spring, males release clouds of sperm, and females release huge numbers of eggs. A tiny percentage of them find each other in the open ocean. The fertilized egg grows and eventually hatches. An embryo swims for its life. As it grows, it takes on the shape of a little lunar lander. It can swim for weeks or months like this.
So as you guys saw, I wanted to show you, I played this section of the video because I wanted you to see what external fertilization is. So external fertilization is when an organism basically releases the eggs and the sperm, the two organisms, out in the water. Typically, this happens in the ocean. And the eggs and sperm fertilize on their own, as opposed to internal fertilization, which is like how mammals would fertilize. Um, this is an interesting, diagram that we're gonna talk about because we're gonna need to understand this in order to understand what happens next. So basically, you have this zygote that right after fertilization where the egg is in. And then the zygote, as you guys know, will start going through the process of mitosis, dividing, and going through these stages of cells, right? So you have 2 cells here. After some time, you have 16 cells, and eventually you have a bunch of cells, and inside those cells, there's a liquid that is a fluid that has been filled. So this is called the blastula. So it's a group of cells filled with liquid. Now that blastula will eventually fold inside in a section. So it will form like a big balloon, and inside there's a little balloon. The gastrula makes basically a 2-layer cells. So now there's like this layer on the outside and this layer on the inside, and now there is an opening. The egg has been continuing to make cells through the whole process, but it stays the same as it continues to develop, and eventually it makes this. And we're going to talk about what this is, right? So this is a gastrula, and you can see all these cells continue to develop, and now we have multiple layers of cells. We have this inside part, we have this inner section here, the red part and the blue part. So let's look at those parts. So we have the inside part called the endoderm. That will eventually become the digestive system for the organism. Then we have the ectoderm, which is on the outer part, becomes the skin and the nervous system of the organism. And the red part will call the mesoderm, meso because it's in the middle, becomes the muscle, the tissue, and circulatory, excretory, and respiratory systems. So you're going to have to understand that the gastrula basically forms 3 layers: the outer layer, the endoderm, the middle layer, the mesoderm, and the inside layer, the endoderm, the middle layer, the mesoderm, and the outer layer, the ectoderm. Make sure you review those terms, and you draw this diagram and label it and explain what each of these terms are. And this is the end of our video. Make sure you go and review